Oh,
Where's a bit of
hello.
paper?
I didn't see you there. That's what you got to do.
I need paper I can shuffle and then like put in a stack and then
Oh,
put them somewhere.
that's a good idea. Yeah.
Oh, what was that they used to do that on?
The
The Daily
news.
Show. It's a
It's
Daily
like
Show.
all yeah, they do it on all the
Yeah, yeah.
news anchors do it,
I
right?
guess I'm thinking Police
Yeah, I got some
Squad.
paper over here.
Or actually, but we have to do it with Xbox games.
Here we go. Here we go.
Just kind of like, oh, hello. Oh, is that what
Here
you're
we
gonna do? Classy.
So I've got it right. This just came in off the wire. System.net. I don't know. It's just like.
I've got this slide that I always get in trouble when I use. I'm going to use it tomorrow, and it says confidential NDA content. Microsoft's secret plans for remaining in third place. I think it's pretty funny, but they don't like it. The bosses.
Yeah.
All right, it is the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up, also known as Damien wears Seahawks gears and we ask him questions.
Go Hawks!
I got the band name right. Right? Is that correct? Seahawks.
Dude, well done.
All right, excellent. So yes, it is the 8th of December, and are we doing this on the 22nd? I'm actually taking vacation for a couple weeks, but I guess I will come out of vacation to push the start button on Google Hangouts until we get a proper
Right, so
account.
next week is the 15th. I guess we do it next week. I'm here.
Yeah,
I'm
we
not
can do
going
it.
anywhere, so I'll be here all the
That's
week.
fine. That's fine. I'm cool with that.
So if you want to do it every week, I'm happy to.
I mean, I can hang out. Just text me, as long as I'm
Stuff's
home.
still happening, so.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm hanging out with I'm going to take off tomorrow. I'm going to take off next 3 weeks, which means I'll be only checking email twice a day.
Nice.
No, it's going to be good. I'll do a couple podcasts, but we're having fun. All right.
Twice a day for 4 hours each checking time, right?
This is
When you
Tuesday.
check email, there'll be like 4,000 emails. So.
I will say this, and because I love to tease people. Big news coming tomorrow.
Oh,
There
is
you
it?
go. That's all I got.
Oh.
But I can't tell you what it is. But now
I
I've
don't know what it
messed
is.
with you. It's huge.
I don't know what it is.
But let's not talk about it. I've said too much.
Okay.
Anything Denny.net, ASP.NET related news? Does things still compile?
Things still compile. Some things still compile. There's a build break at the moment. I just tweeted like 10 minutes ago, and I have a bunch of people asking me questions about it. We just broke 800,000 requests per second on Kestrel.
At all?
We broke through 700,000 like last week or the week before.
Yeah.
And now like someone tweeted, remember when we barely broke 40,000 requests per second? Yeah, and like I remember when we started it was 700. So we have a 100,000 or 1,000% improve, 1,000 times improvement at the moment. So that's good. And I think we'll hit 1 million pretty soon, I think. And I'm going to bring copious amounts of champagne in when we hit 1 million because why not? It's an arbitrary number, but it's a nice one.
Make sure you
So that's
have
good.
some sparkling cider.
No, you're not coming.
So disrespectful. There might be people who don't drink.
There is water in the tap. You can drink water.
It's not sparkling.
There's soda in the fridge. You can
Oh,
drink
there's
soda.
Talking Rain, though.
All right, I'll do it.
Talking Rain.
If you can find me a $40 bottle of cider of non-alcoholic sparkling pop, I will bring in a celebratory pop just for folks like you.
All right, I'll take the free soda.
You could probably get a really high-class root beer, like a way high-end root beer.
I've never seen a $40 bottle of root beer.
Yeah,
I've seen like a $7 bottle of root beer.
Yeah.
Actually, before we go to the Q&A, which this show has become, which is great, I want to just give a shout-out again to this product, the website, get.asp.net. I want to just say kudos to you. I went to get.asp.net yesterday on an Ubuntu machine. Right there, get.asp.net. And I would ask both of the listeners, the viewers, do us a favor, friends, tweet about this. Just say, wow, I was impressed that I could go to get.asp.net and get ASP.NET working in minutes. I clicked on install instructions and Linux, and I tell you, man, I had a lovely website running in minutes on Ubuntu, and it was impressive as heck.
That's great.
It was literally just copy-paste. I got a little bit confused because of the libuv thing. I'm going to update the docs myself, just because I didn't realize I needed it. So basically, I got
To the end, you stopped.
I got
Yep.
to here and I stopped because
I
I
did the
saw
same
mono.
thing. No, I did the same thing.
So I think we need to put the libuv part higher.
Yep.
And then this part here, it wasn't clear that you really don't need mono.
Yes, I have given the exact same feedback.
So I'm going to
Yep.
clean this up a little bit.
Yep.
But honestly, it was pretty darn easy.
That's good. We're making
And
some
a joy.
tweaks to it.
I'm going to show it tomorrow at the Linux Foundation.
Okay, we are making some tweaks to it right now. We're going to add the version number so that when you click the green button, it's very evident that you're getting, like, because we did RC1 update 1, people weren't sure if the website had been updated because it just says like install for Windows, so we're adding the version number in there. And then we're experimenting with when you click the green button and it starts the download, having it also navigate you to a page that then gives you more information about what the next step should be. Like very succinctly, these are the next 3 things you should do, and then click here to go off and read the very in-depth, getting started guide. Because we think that it'd be nice to give you kind of those next steps after you actually get the download. So we're experimenting with those changes right now.
Cool.
Someone asked me so Miguel just asked me on Twitter, would love to know what changes are responsible for the improvements in Kestrel. Right now, the vast majority of improvements, if not all of them, are coming just from reducing allocations. So we did a whole bunch of work to reduce compute. So we were doing standard CPU profiling. We would find out where most of our time was being spent, like what methods on the stack were taking up most of the time. And then we would reduce those calls or optimize those methods, add caching or remove whatever. And then we found that a lot of the time was just being spent in garbage collection. Like the profiler was telling us, yes, you were spending time in this method, but 60% of it was in garbage collection. Like, oh, well, that should probably be our focus now. And I've said it before on the show. I've said that we were allocating more than a gigabyte of memory per second when we hit about 500,000 requests per second. There was no way we were going to be able to scale to a few million requests per second if we were already allocating a gigabyte a second at 500,000. And so over the last couple of weeks, almost all of the focus has been on reducing how much memory we use. And that has seen massive gains. We've gone from just under 500,000 to 800,000 just by not allocating as much stuff. And that is just the world of building very high-performant managed servers, is that you have to reduce GC.
At some point it would be really cool to have, even if it was just a bullet list, but like some of those things you're saying now, it'd be really cool to have that like a tiny blog post or even like bullet lists. Like someday for you guys to do a talk on it, like what you did, because this is really interesting. I mean, like.
I agree. I will say if we did a talk, it would not be anything that someone hasn't done before.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of articles about how to build highly performant .NET code, and you have to at some point, you're going to start running into GC issues. And we've got to that point, which is good. Now we're at that point where we have to be very cognizant of what we allocate. But
what part of this is different because it's an HTTP server?
That's true. Yeah. So I mean, the optimizations that you make, once you hit the point where you have to reduce the memory, you have to say, well, what am I going to reduce? What can I not allocate every time? What are the characteristics of the object lifetimes that I have? So in our case, in a benchmark, someone creates a TCP socket, the client connects to the server, opens a socket, a bunch of state is created, objects in memory, and then they start sending requests. Those requests have their own state, but they're a lot more short-lived than the objects that are assigned to the connection, because the connection is reused due to HTTP keep alive. So now you have in your mind there's these 2 lifetimes intrinsic to an HTTP server before you start doing anything in your app. There's like the underlying socket, and then there's the requests and the responses that happen on that socket. And then when you look at the particular benchmark we're doing, we're sending 16 requests in a batch, right? And then because we're doing pipelining, and then we send 16 responses in a batch. And so that's kind of a second, a tertiary scope that we have to think about. What optimizations can we make that particularly benefit that scenario? And so with a bunch of stuff around, if you open a connection, then you make 16 identical HTTP requests, or you just make a request and get a response, and you just do it over and over. A lot of the work you do is identical from a request to request. And it's the type of stuff that is primed for caching. So for example, when we have to pass HTTP headers, they come in on the wire as bytes, right? They're literal bytes. Like if you get down to the socket, there's a sine wave of electrons, and then there is at some point there are bytes,
Yeah.
And then there is an understanding between the client and the server that these bytes are encoded using ASCII, because it's HTTP headers. And so you need to treat these bytes as ASCII characters, and you need to turn them into characters so you can parse them and do the right thing. Then we need to populate, data structures that the application will actually use, like HTTP header collections. But there's no reason to do work until you actually need to do the work. And so we can do things like say, well, this octet of bytes, so these 8 bytes right here, rather than turning these into a string, if I just calculate these 8 bytes as a long, does that long and then look up that long in a table, do I have a matching record in this table that matches this number? And if the answer is yes, then just take the result from the table and use that. Like, don't even bother to parse the bytes and turn them into a string and then try and compare the string and parse that again. Just go, well, I know these bytes, look, it's in this table. I can do a lookup much faster than I can do parsing. So it's identifying those types of optimizations that you can make. And then like just turning up the dial and trying to do that without getting too dangerous, because if you go too far, you can end up over-optimizing for certain cases that are just benchmark worthy and not real life worthy, which is why it's important to have benchmarks that test more than one thing, which we do. And so we have all that variance and stuff, and we can test the baseline, very focused benchmark, see a change, and then rerun the other benchmarks and see what type of impact the improvement of the core had on the rest of the scenarios.
That was my next question. Is like you're talking about the plain text benchmarks still mostly, right? But you guys have done some more work on some of the other benchmarks as well.
So we have in the benchmarks repo has plain text, it has JSON, it has the single query database, the multiple query database, and the fortunes benchmarks, which does HTML rendering. And we have versions of I think all of those. For the database ones, we have a version that uses raw.adio.net, we have MD Framework, and we have Dapper. For some of the other ones, we have MVC versions as well as raw middleware versions. And so we can kind of see the variance and like how much performance drops off when you move from one test to another. And also, when we see an increase in plain text performance of 100,000 requests per second, what type of increase do we see in the JSON test? Right? You do see an increase. It's just not as high, obviously, because the overhead is in a different place. But you do still see an improvement. And so by focusing on the the very lowest layer and getting that to be the smallest overhead as possible, it actually makes it easier to rationalize about what is sucking in your performance when you get to the more realistic tests. It's like, well, I know the core is not a problem because the core can do millions of requests per second. So it must be, what did we change when you do JSON? Well, these are the only two things that change. They're all, I mean, at the end of the day, it's all just data. And you have to, the data means nothing. It's how you interpret it and what you compare it to and all that type of stuff that really matters. So that's happening. What else? I was building a sample of how to use the localization stuff that we did. That's going on in the entropy repo. It's in a branch right now. In doing that, basically I'm taking file new MVC app and I'm localizing it into French. So there's an English version and a French version in the same app, and then you can set your browser to French, and then the home page comes up in French and all the rest of it. In doing that, I found some atrocious performance problems with our localization stack, which I fixed yesterday. Again, that was just caching. We were not utilizing the .NET Resource Manager class in the way that it was intended, because it's always kind of been used in a particular way, and the new abstraction that we built to do localization wasn't using it in the correct way, so I fixed that. And so we got our performance back to where it should be, so that was good. And for people who are wondering how to use the localization stuff, we have no documentation on it right now. We barely have any samples, so it's kind of hard to figure out this brand new abstraction that we built when we haven't really told anyone how to use it. So I'm building that sample right now so people can have a look at how to use the new localization features. A lot of the team is working very hard on the .NET CLI work to get our ASP.NET 5 up and running on top of .NET CLI. That's not going to happen for a while, and in like when can people actually start doing it? You can install the .NET CLI bits right now from GitHub, and you can run an ASP.NET 5 app on the .NET CLI if you know the right changes to make. But it'll be quite a few weeks yet before you can just grab a nightly build, which is where we're getting to. You'll be able to go to get.asp.net, click the other downloads link, and there'll be a button there to get the last dev build. And that will give you an installer that will install the .NET CLI and the ASP.NET 5 stuff. Currently, I don't think we're going to get that until January at this rate. Because what we're tracking to, obviously, is RC2, which is going to be around mid-February at this rate. So yeah, so all that's happening. What else is going on? Some perf work going on in MVC. We've got a bunch of people working on fundamentals, so setting up more repeatable perf benchmarks and stress benchmarks and things like that. What else is going on? We've been meeting with some customers around hosting scenarios and ensuring that we have good guidance and good features for using ASP.NET 5 in Kestrel in hosting environments. I think what else has happened in the last week. Oh no, that's about it at the top of my mind, so we should probably answer some questions.
Okay, so, quick one. Peter wants to know, when are the ads coming off the ASP.NET website? And I can speak to that, actually. We wanted to remove the ads, but we also talked to people in the ASP.NET controls community and people who are vendors and stuff like that. And honestly, some of these smaller groups, that's their primary source of income. Right now, we've got DevExpress up there, but there are also a number of folks that are supported almost entirely by the traffic that gets generated off those ads. The ASP.NET website gets many, many millions of page views a month. I think it's something in the tens of millions. And that generates traffic off of those ads. So what we've done instead is we put the ads on a particular location, and we have put in standards for ads. If you find an ad is too flashy or offensive or too clashy, and we've also put featured ad at a very clear location there. We've tried to minimize the ads, but ads fuel some of the companies. They don't just pay the bills, but they help those companies. I don't want to make an entire company disappear because we remove the ads.
Ecosystem, right?
Supports the ecosystem. One of the things we've talked about are possibly putting in like an open source project could advertise for free, and we'd put that as like 1/10 of the ads or some percentage of the ads. So we can talk to Scott Hunter about things like that. But I'd like to use the ads to support the ecosystem. So let's look at ways to have some ads for projects and put that in part of the like a non-profit kind of a thing. So
Stack Overflow's done really well with that, right? I mean, that's a good example. So.
Exactly. So we're trying to support the ecosystem. Brandon wants to know if anything's being done to enable third-party packages like Stack Exchange Redis, and Michael Conrad replies cleverly in the questions that Mark and some of the GitHub folks are talking about bringing Stack Exchange Redis into ASP.NET Core, which would make sense.
They're already porting that stuff to .NET Core.
Right, which makes sense. And there's also a great thing that we talked about last week where Mark Gravel has got a series on doing that. So yes, it'll happen. And given, of course, that Redis as a service is also run by Scott Hunter and is supported in ASP.NET, it makes sense to do that.
Yep, absolutely.
Vladislav wants to know, what about WebSockets? We seem to get this one every week. They could really use them for server to inform client about updates. There's the SignalR in the future situation, but what about just WebSockets in general?
So there's a WebSockets middleware. It's at github.com/ASP.NET/WebSockets. It has been punted from the RTM release as a supported package, but the code compiles and works. So we know that Ben from Familiar Games is using it for Age of Ascent. They did a live test on the weekend. Their first live test on Kestrel, ASP.NET 5, .NET Core, using that WebSockets middleware, and he said it worked quite well. That was what's that?
Who is it?
Ben Olin, the guy who's doing all of our perf work on Kestrel.
Oh, wow! Is there a website about this or a feature? Can we point to their game?
Age of Ascent, and the company is Iliad Games. So he is the CTO, and so he has made a strategic decision to run their socket server, the game server.
Oh, this was on a Kickstarter.
Yeah, they've made a decision to run it on top of ASP.NET 5 on .NET Core, as opposed to running a custom .NET server. And so he's been doing an awful lot of work in the Kestrel repo. In fact, he's the number two contributor now to the Kestrel repo, and he's a community member because his company is going to be using it to run their game, which is fantastic.
I remember this. Oh my goodness, I never put the two and two together.
Oh,
That's this.
okay.
It's this here, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they had a live test. Yeah. And so we met Ben. He came here a few weeks ago. He sat in this very chair, and we had a good chat with him. So he's doing great work for us with Kestrel at the moment. And he's using the WebSockets middleware. So we have WebSockets support. You can use the middleware. It's just that it will not RTM at the same time as the rest of the stack. What does that mean? It means that if you want to pay Microsoft for support
Yeah.
then you can't. That's all it means. Like that is literally the only difference. It is
Oh,
code. It works.
look
It'll
at
ship.
that. You guys, they have a dev blog.
Yeah.
Where have I
Oh yeah,
been?
yeah. We featured
Like
some of this
they
stuff.
have posts on how they're doing
Holy
all this.
crap. Look
Yeah.
at this.
So he did a
Ben,
big post after we did the community stand-up where I was out there showing the perf rig. He has a
Uh-huh.
blog post on there about that.
Will you introduce me to this person? Have him on the podcast.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, my goodness. Love it.
yeah, he's the guy that did that Rio thing, right? I
Yes,
mean,
he did the original
See,
Rio prototype as well.
that's awesome. Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful. Okay, cool. So,
So yeah. So use WebSockets. It's just that it won't be RTM at the same time. So if you want to call us and pay us to get support, you won't be able to. But log issues on GitHub and we'll fix them, just like everything else. That's the only
all right,
difference.
cool.
Um,
Sorry, do you want to pick these?
no, you can go for it.
Any plans to support localizing tag helper before RTM?
No. Funny you should say that. So we have a spec on how to build a localization tag helper such that localizing views is a little less intrusive. As I said just before, I am going through the process of building a localized example template right now. And after having done a good portion of that, I've realized that, geez, the tag helper would be really nice. So I just branched, before I sat down, I just created a branch in the MVC repo where I'm going to create the localization tag helper as a prototype. And then what we're working on is a way for us to ship prototype packages that we don't intend to RTM in March next year. Because there's a bunch of stuff that, like, I can go off and spend 5 hours building the initial spike of a package, and I would love for that to be up on NuGet so that people can just grab it and use it, but have it be very clear that it's not part of the supported set yet, either by way of its name or its name and its version, etc., etc., and then having a process so that we know when those things get rolled into the real thing that those things die. We don't really have a mechanism for that right now, so I'm going to start that right now so that things like this can actually happen, because I want to get the localization tag helper out there so we can iterate on it, so people can use it, even if it's not officially done yet. So there you go.
All right. Is it possible to decouple dependency injection to handle it in a class library instead of startup.js? I mean, you could
Yes,
just
but you would have to
call
call
down
it
to
from
it.
startups. Yes.
Yeah,
So-
you have to plug it into startup.js, which would
Correct.
be using dependency injection or not at all. Like if you want to just make a function, stick it
you
somewhere
could just-
else and call it from
So,
there.
yes. So the way it works is that the dependency injection is a feature of the ASP.NET hosting layer. The hosting layer is the thing that calls startup. Calls the methods on the startup class. It discovers the startup class and then calls the methods on it. You can emulate a lot of that code yourself. There's the web application builder API that you can use to sort of circumvent or manually bootstrap that yourself, and you can create the DI container in there to an extent. But you still have to plug it into that pipeline. Like there's no
you could do some
the lowest layer is the hosting abstraction, and that calls the startup class.
You could do some sort of like AOP, like attribute-based kind of discovery thing. Like, I mean, if you didn't want to like hand wire it in, right?
Well, so the contract as it
Ultimately,
exists.
something to call it. Yeah.
Right. The contract as it exists is that the hosting layer will give you an iService collection, and you have to either mutate the iService collection that is given to you or return an iService provider after having been given an iService collection. That is the contract. So you can do whatever you like in between those two calls. We call you with an iService collection, and we expect an iService provider back. You can do whatever you want to produce the iService provider, right? If you want to put that in a class library and have your own composition model and knock yourself out, but you'll have to plug it into your startup CS, just like we said.
Yep. Will you clarify if WebSockets will run on Linux? WebSockets 2.0?
WebSockets 2 will run on Linux. And then, I don't know what WebSockets 2.0 is.
I don't know what WebSockets 2. Maybe they're saying HTTP 2.
Maybe. We don't have an HTTP 2 timeline yet. Can the community
I'm not sure if
compile...
that question is WebSockets 2 on Linux or HTTP 2 with WebSockets on
So,
Linux.
as I understand it, the WebSocket middleware that we have should work on Linux. It doesn't have any Windows dependency that I'm aware of. It is a purely managed implementation of the WebSocket framing protocol that utilizes assuming you're running on Kestrel, or a server that supports what we call opaque upgrade, it should work. So, yeah. Try it and let us know if it doesn't. Log a bug.
Any plans to extend test server?
The test server stuff is... That's a good question. Extend how?
I extended the current version to navigate requests, fill in forms, and
Oh,
posts, and
God,
extended the
no.
client to access server objects for reading
No,
security code.
no. We have no plans to turn the test server into a more generalized sort of client automation server or library. If you want to do client automation, like that's what you're sort of on the cusp of there, is extend it yourself. That's fine. Build extension methods or helper libraries that will, given a test server, do that automation for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I am wondering if output caching will block localization from retrieving the right values. Do we need vary by custom for localization for output caching?
We have vary by custom, and that's one of the reasons you do it. Yes. So traditionally, how this works is that if you're using output caching or any type of UI caching, fragment caching, you need to vary by language if you're doing a localization. What you vary by will depend on how you determine language. So if you're only using the accepts language header as the thing that determines language, then you would just vary by that header. If you're using a cookie, then you would vary by that cookie. If you're setting language by a database profile, then you would have to use a custom vary by. Now we support all those things with our cache tag helper. We do not have output caching at all right now. We have not built or shipped an output caching provider. That has yet to be done and will not be done for 1.0. When it does come along, we will have vary by custom.
Sorry, something bad is happening here. Hang on.
Oh.
No, like
the world is ending, or you have high CPU.
Like you get those the IMs. It's
Yes.
like, oh crap. Sorry. There's a bold statement. Having Roslyn in VS almost replaces LinkPad. Nothing replaces LinkPad. There are features like grids and SQL trace output. I think they're talking about the REPL. Is there an option to achieve those in VS? Grids and SQL trace output. SQL trace output we can get with the way that we're doing.
Well, so okay. I mean, depends on. We might have a few of these things independently, but nothing like how LinkPad is designed as a focused experience.
Right.
For
and between LinkPad and Glimpse and the new debugging stuff in Visual Studio, that's pretty sweet. If you want to talk about Roslyn and VS, talk to Casey Uhlenhuth. She champions that stuff. She's on Twitter. Casey with a K, K-E-S-E-Y, Uhlenhuth, Uhlenhuth. That's how you spell her name. She's awesome. Okay, how will standing up a Kestrel server using the .NET CLI work?
No different. So remember, Kestrel is not a host. In ASP.NET 5, the server is something that you depend on and participates in the hosting sort of bootstrapping phase of the app. So the server has to be aware of ASP.NET hosting and it plugs into that layer, but your application depends on it. The server doesn't boot you, you boot the server. So when it comes to the .NET CLI, you have your app, the .NET CLI runs your app, and then part of your app is you have a dependency on ASP.NET hosting and a dependency on Kestrel. And when hosting is the thing that gets run, because that's what happens when you run an ASP.NET 5 app, you run the static void main, that calls into webapplication.run. Webapplication.run is part of ASP.NET hosting. That then has a whole phase where it discovers what server you're using based on the arguments that you pass in and some smart defaults. And then the Kestrel, in this case, runs, like boots up, and the handoff between hosting your application and the server takes place at that point.
Cool. Between value providers, model binders, baking annotations, and models, the validation story in ASP.NET feels like an arrangement of disparate parts. No question there, but a comment on style for validation.
Possibly. So I guess it depends on the way you look at it. So the way I think about it is there is an aspect that declares your validation. So given a particular model, say customer, you declare your validation generally by way of validation attributes, which is part of the component model data annotations system. And that has been that way since before .NET 4, since dynamic data came out in, 2009, 2008. So they declare validation, and you can create new validation rules by way of creating validation attributes. Now you can say I want to get validation from other places, but I'm just talking about like the mainline thing here. So you have a place that says, please validate this field using the required validator. That's an attribute. Then you have a thing that, given a model or given a set of input, can rationalize, okay, I have some input. That input is to be applied to this model, and this model has this validation, okay, is by way of these attributes. All those things are pluggable via providers. So where the value comes from, the input, that is pluggable by the value provider system. So that's that first thing there. The thing that determines where validation comes from for a given model, that's pluggable. That's a validation provider. And the thing that provides the validation by default are the validation attributes. So all those systems are pluggable. You can say that my model doesn't get validation from the attributes, it gets them from this other place. You would write a validation provider. And if you want the input to come from a different place, then you write different value providers. But generally, you just use the value providers in the system because you get values from form posts and the query string and those type of things. So I don't know. I mean, I don't see that as being disparate. I just see that as being layered and pluggable. I could see why someone would say, well, you've got this provider and that provider. So, well, yeah, that's because it's all kind of pluggable. I guess some other systems are a lot more opinionated. And so things aren't as pluggable. It's just, this is how validation works. You want to do validation? Write one of these things, and then that's it. You don't get to change where validation comes from. This is the system. And you don't get to change how things are model bound. Like that, that's how it works. So in my mind, it's a logical progression. Yeah, value providers, they feed into model binders. Model binders do validation based on validation.
I think that the judgment call here, the value judgment that he's making is the baking annotations deep in the model. The way that phrase is phrased is saying he doesn't like that. So make partials and put the validations on those.
Which we support, by the way. So we support the concept of buddy types, so that you can have your POCO model that has no validation on it, and then you can put an attribute on that that says, don't look at me for wherever to get data annotation information. Get that from this other type. And if you don't like attributes at all, you can write your own validation provider that gets them from wherever. You can make it imperative if you wanted to, right? You could build. Is there a fluent validation library for MVC?
Yeah.
There are several actually.
Yeah. So like, if you don't like ours, use one of those and do an imperative one instead of a declarative one, right?
All right. This is getting long. There's like 3 people who are doing it the most. Is there a way to make DNX copy static files to the output directory when using a DNX console app? Well, I guess you'd extend it, right? I mean, I don't know what you'd want to do there. I guess
it depends on what operation you're talking about. You're talking about when you run, or you're talking about when you pack?
I assume what's going on here is they're doing a self-host situation. I'm not sure I understand that question fully.
Yeah. I mean, the answer is yes.
There's always a way.
It depends on the context.
Yes.
Are you running like DNX my app name and you want stuff to like appear in, like, there is no output folder in that case. So the only time you'll have an output directory is if you're running DNX build with outputs turned on, or DNX pack, or DNU pack, sorry, which will create a NuGet package. And yes, you can set it up such that arbitrary files end up in the NuGet package. The Kestrel repo does this. That's how we include the libuv DLL in the resultant NuGet package. And there will be an analog in the .NET CLI world.
I'm looking for regarding unit testing of Xproj. Can we get an option in the Test Explorer to choose the target framework?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, my understanding is there's a limitation at the moment in the, like, we plug into the VS test sort of architecture, and it's not incredibly extensible. You only have so many pivots, and you can't just like add UI, for example, to the VS Test Explorer. And right now, as a result of that, you kind of just get tests for one of the pivots, or one of the frameworks you're running on. We've heard that feedback. We're looking at it. We don't have any firm plans on how to fix it that I'm aware of right now.
Yep. I created a new ASP.NET 5 app using the default template. I added Serilog via NuGet, wired it up, wrote to logs, access via DI, started writing logs to a file. However, I see other logs coming through in the file, some of which come other controllers, and others further up in the pipeline. How do I get rid of them? So they're
You would
seeing a lot of stuff. Probably you're probably seeing, I'm just guessing here, default trace listeners and other trace.write lines appearing from other stuff.
I mean, that all really depends on how Serolog's sync configuration works.
Yeah.
So if you're doing it via our logging provider, remember our stuff, all of our frameworks do logging. And we did a whole bunch of optimizations in RC1 around what parts of the ASP.NET framework log at the information level, because that's the default one, so that when you run from the console by default with the console logger, you get nice, helpful information as a developer. You need to look at how you configure Serolog's syncs so that you can filter out the sources that you don't want. Because everything in ASP.NET is its own source. And so if you don't want to see stuff from us, you'll have to turn it off.
Yep.
I guess. That's a guess.
Yep. And again, if you have the default trace writer stuff turned on, you're just going to get traces from the world, from everything in the app. So like, you can't stop that, right?
Well, like, what do you mean? Like, it depends on who's calling the static trace trace.
I'm just saying, if you have an app, an inherited application, and you're copying code over, you're bringing code over, and someone's calling debug.writeLine or trace.writeLine,
yes,
within your request, there's not much you can do.
No, because that goes into the global trace listener, and you would have to turn off that as a sync in whatever your ultimate destination for trace messages is, which in this case is Serolog.
Here's an interesting one. I've read a couple of existing articles. I am not clear what an ASP.NET console application is.
Yeah, we kind of stuffed up the messaging there. So the truth is that in ASP.NET 5, everything is a console app. Now, that naming in the template was just because we didn't want to use the letters D and X in the public-facing bits. We didn't want there to be a DNX project. We kind of wanted it to be a hidden thing. Mm-hmm. And so we had a project template called a console application parentheses package. So it was basically a console app that builds to a package. That is the same thing as an ASP.NET 5 app. But they're all the same thing. There isn't really a different type of application anymore. It's like they are all console apps. So even with the .NET CLI, that's just codifying that more. .NET CLI apps are console apps in the traditional sense, and ASP.NET 5 apps are console apps in that sense as well. Like they have a static void main, so that when you run them, there is a defined entry point, and then the part that starts the ASP.NET-ness of the app is the call into Microsoft.ASP.NET.hosting, and that static API is web application.run. That is where ASP.NET starts. Everything before that is just .NET console app. Okay, so if you want to see an interesting example of what an ASP.NET 5 app that also has console interaction looks like, that is when I run it from the command line, which you have to because it's a console app, that it starts the web server, but I can also type things into the console while it's running and get feedback. Look at the benchmarks repo. I made that change last week. So now when you run the benchmarks app, you can hit C, the letter C in the console, and it'll force a garbage collection. And if you hit any, and it will print it out to the screen so you can see it. Then if you hit any other key, it will give you stats about how many garbage collections have occurred. So the app is running, the server is sitting there listening, but it's also interacting at the console because everything is a console app now. So.
All right. So many. Oh, so Rob Sherrill emailed me a couple of days ago, and he really doesn't like the flow of the GitHub, of the Hangouts thing, and there's talk about maybe doing another chat room. We ought to formalize if it's Git or if it's Jabber. I like that this is integrated, but the amount of work required from the viewer is log into YouTube, merge your Google account with your YouTube account if they existed before the Google+. There's Google identity crap. Once you do all that work, you go to live. Here's the thing, though. Let's think about it from a user interface perspective. You hit live.asp.net.
Yeah, you hit the button.
So we need to figure out a way to get the Google Q&A.
You basically can't. So I looked into that when I first built live.asp.net. From what I could understand, and someone please contact me if I'm understanding it wrong, the Hangouts API as it exists is designed for doing the opposite. It's designed for building apps that live in Hangouts, not for integrating Hangouts into your web page. The way you integrate Hangouts into your web page is via an embed, which is effectively just a YouTube player.
Right. So
couldn't figure out a way to do like add questions and stuff via the live URL.
All right, let's bang through this. I've got sick kids, and I've got a 4:30 as well that I'm late for.
Okay.
You've suggested using Nginx in front of Kestrel. Is that how it's done in Azure Web Apps? Well, Nginx goes in front of Kestrel when you're doing things in Linux on a VM in production. You'd put IIS in front of Kestrel on
Windows.
On Windows, and that's how it'll be set up automatically in Azure Websites.
Yep, that's how it works right now in Azure Websites.
Okay. When will spatial SQL Server data types be supported in EF7 so we can do ASP.NET sites with maps? Probably an issue question for the Entity Framework folks. Ask Rowan Miller and the friends over there at Entity Framework in the issues section. They should have a published roadmap. That was Jerome Archer.
Mm-hmm.
Any words on part 2 and 3 of the tutorials on MVA? Thomas wants to know that. So we did part 1. I know we promised an advanced version and a Linux version, but because RC1 and RC2 changed, we shifted things a little bit because we didn't want to do an advanced version and a Linux version that wasn't correct. Right. I want the Linux version also to support containers. So if I had a guess, February for advanced, maybe March, April for Linux, but that's a guess. You want to guess as well?
That's as good a guess as any.
It's a good guess as any. Considering that I just made it up, but it's a great question. What is the state of system.net.mail?
No idea.
I have no idea. That would be a question for the .NET Core.
CoreFX repo. GitHub/.net/CoreFX.
Mahmout, good question for the folks at CoreFX. Yeah, so here someone has put an issue, and I'm going to link to it, issue 484, which is an ASP.NET hosting issue, throwing async void messes Kestrel, close Kestrel. Taylor Mullen had a discussion about async void methods crashing Kestrel. Pretty sure async void is not a good idea.
Async
so you want to do that. Any attention? Crash, okay, so the question is, the individual closed it, but didn't put what the issue is. Okay. What's the issue number? Boom. Comment. We'll find out. I've just asked Samir. I've asked them on the website there, so we'll see if we can figure that out. I know you're a DEF CON release candidate right now. Has there been any discussions about ASP.NET validation, like contextual validation? That's kind of a combination of the previous question around validation. I think the point around validation is that there's our stuff, there's lots of Fluent stuff, but the whole thing is completely extensible. So if you don't like validation, there's other ways to do it.
To be clear, all we really did in this version was take over what we already had from MVC5 and optimize it, and but we didn't drastically change it. Like, it hasn't been redesigned. If you want a different validation system, plug in a different validation system.
Person, of course, pointing out that MailKit works on DNX Core 5 for email. And then, this is a valid point. Vladislav wants to know that he's never heard ASP.NET and web components said at the same time. Any development in this area?
Well, so
it's a front end.
The first thing I say is web components is completely client side, and so ASP.NET is server side, and so
I think that it'll be nice to have web components and tag helpers working together. I see it working out nicely.
But even then, like that's all words that sound great. That's a candy question. But like the next question is, what exactly does that mean to have them work together? Like, a web component is completely client-side, is absolutely fundamentally client-side.
I get that. I just think that if there were server-side components with client-side web components projections, you could make it look a little web formsy if you wanted to, I suppose.
Maybe. It gets really, like, I just caution people, that stuff gets really tricky really quickly. And there's a reason why most people end up saying you either build a SPA or you don't. And trying to do some weird hybrid ends up getting particularly... No one solved that. Like, that is not really a thing that exists en masse today. There's lots of niche things that people have attempted. People should watch Steve Sanderson's talk from the MVP Summit about some of the experiments and investigations we're doing to better utilize our server-side, ASP.NET, to improve SPA applications by way of things like pre-rendering. But the idea of a server component, like we traditionally think of it, like a web control, that is somehow also a web component, you can certainly make things do stuff, but a web component is just a way to encapsulate a bunch of client glue, together. So.
When deploying to IIS, what is the default and optional source protection? The default is to deploy artifacts, not the source code, to IIS.
Yeah, so the point is that IIS generally is pointed at a folder that contains nothing anyway. So like with the way that our hosting model works now, you point IIS at a folder that literally has only a web.config file in it and nothing else. Because it's your app that's serving the static files and doing the compilation, all sort of stuff. So IIS doesn't see anything except the web.config file.
Mm-hmm. All right. What is the equivalent for DNX Core 50 as a framework target?
There isn't one yet.
Forward. So I haven't figured all that out yet.
As a framework target, it becomes, currently it's DOT NET 5.4. That will likely change to Net Standard something, 1.4 or something. But DNX Core 50 is special because that's an application TFM, not a framework TFM. Meaning we don't have the current TFM equivalent for what it means to be, I'm an app that runs on the .NET CLI, as opposed to, I'm a class library that needs a bunch of API. That's different things. We don't have that TFM yet. It doesn't exist. Yep. Ask me again in a month.
And then just finally, Hisham points out that they have put up some localization helpers.
Yeah, Hisham is just pinging me on every possible channel he can because I haven't looked at his PR yet.
Okay, so good reminder. Good reminder for you. All right, I have to go.
Okay.
And you have to go. Let's do some dramatic zoom out and thank everyone for your patience as we rush a little bit here at the end.
Thanks, everyone.
Dramatic zoom out. We need a theme song. Dramatic zoom out. All right. Bum 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 bum.